Hey guys, we're live. Welcome to our Cold War stream, and we're going to talk about things during the Cold War because maybe some of you know it, like some broad knowledge about it. Some of you may know the inner workings of it, but Charlie and I are going to work on it. We're going to work with you to talk about the Cold War and like all the most of the important events that happened within it. So I'm Jed. I'll be your streamer. I'll be your co-streamer today, and we have.
Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm a sophomore in high school, and then I'll be working with Jed as well to do this lesson.
Once again, Cold War today.
So before we go into this lesson, if you could go on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube and follow at ThinkFiveable, any of our Fiveable accounts, be sure to do that.
All right, so we're going to talk today about the Cold War, which is unfortunately not going to be a topic this year, but it's still important. If you want to, like, especially if you want to, in your conclusion paragraphs in your DBQ, if you want to connect it in some way to the Cold War moving forward or in the future, you can use this stream like as a resource. We're going to talk about like local events in Asia and Africa. So we're gonna focus on Sukarno, Indonesia, and in Ghana we have Nkrumah. And we're gonna look at the Cold War, some examples. We're gonna look at the effects of the Cold War. What was its impact to the globe? So we'll see some familiar names: Korean War, Sandinista in Nicaragua, and the Angolan Civil War. And then we're gonna also zoom in on the end of the Cold War. So what happens at the end? Because that's a really critical point. Because technically it took like a long time and like 40-50 years and there was no one had a clue when it's going to end, but we're going to look at symbolic events that set in stone like the end of the Cold War and the ushering of the new era.
Okay, so just contextualization so you can better understand the Cold War before we get into the actual events that we're going to describe later. So as Jed mentioned, the Cold War is not your typical war where it would last usually a shorter amount of time, something like World War I or World War II, which lasted on an average of 5-6 years. The Cold War is from 1947 to 1991, which is a little less than 50 years. So the Cold War, one thing they have to understand about the Cold War is that the Cold War is not one war. You have the Cold War, which is just a time of hostility, essentially. It's not the war that we think of with fighting and weaponry. It is, as King Dan of Denmark said, it's a proxy war. So it's mainly between the United States and their supporters, the Soviet Union and their supporters, and a bunch of proxy wars that happened. And essentially what a proxy war is when you start a war in another nation, but you don't directly participate in that war. So we're going to be going over some of the proxy wars later, as Jed mentioned earlier. So at the end of World War II, President Truman passes the Truman Doctrine, which is basically gives him the right to contain geopolitical expansion of communism. So when we're talking about geopolitical, we're talking about land, geography, and then with political, we're talking about politics and international relations. And eventually this ends in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Essentially, the Soviet Union breaks up into new independent nations that still exist to this day. And just so you know, just vocab, when we refer to the Eastern Bloc, we're talking about the communist nations. We're talking about the Soviet Union. We're talking about North Korea at this time. But when we talk about the Western Bloc, we're talking about the United States and democratic allies. The 1950s and late 1940s were definitely a time of communist paranoia in the United States especially. We had the deaths of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were imprisoned because they were assumed to be spying for the Soviet Union. And then we also have McCarthyism, which is this hostility and fear of communism in the United States that was caused by U.S. Senator McCarthy. And he essentially, he believed he had the numbers of all the Communist Party members in the United States. And this caused a lot of hostility. People were fearing that they would lose their jobs. or be sent to prison, and that's what McCarthyism is, period, in the 1950s. Next slide.
All right, so now that we know what happened, so we know that, so keep it in mind that once again, it's about proxies. It's about like these, the US, Soviet Union, and their allies, respective allies, intervening in these areas. So now let's start with Indonesia. So if you remember, it was known as the Dutch East Indies back then. So they were like a direct colony of the Netherlands, and like any other, so there's a reason why this unit was technically coupled with decolonization, because at this time they were able to like the Indonesian people were able to wrestle independence from the Netherlands. So this is through the Partai Nasional Indonesia, which is like a movement or like a organization that's meant to facilitate all of this. And then we see the notable figure we have here is Sukarno, he was like a leader, was a president from like 1945 to 67. And if you're familiar with modern politics, you're probably wondering, that's longer than expected. Like the U.S. president's only for like 4 years, some presidents are like for 6 years. Why is he there for like 13 years? So he is actually a fervent opponent of imperialism. Once again, all ties back to decolonization. He doesn't like foreign interference. He doesn't want anyone other than his people, like foreign especially the Europeans, to like just call the shots, to just control like the country, because like their history, they've been exporting a lot of goods and manufactured goods. So they already know like all the abuses that's been done to them and all that. And so as a result, he opposed capitalism, which is something that you would at this time, or even before this time, you would associate with imperialism. And he was influenced by Marxism, which makes sense politically and geographically, because it has some ties, like in trading with the Chinese, with the Vietnamese. So like all these local influences. So it's like a so like a brief segue. It's like once again, it's why like there's this thing called domino theory, where the U.S. was afraid that if this one state close to another state falls to communism, then the other will fall too, because these have like strong ties. So Sukarno had that, and he was influenced by Marxism. So during this time, he technically like he was one of those like who orchestrated like the mass killings of 1965 to 66, because to call like political dissidents, like opponents within the Communist Party, like certain ethnic groups, certain ethnic minorities. We see even like just certain age groups. We see like people that they wouldn't consider like the elderly, they wouldn't consider like useful to the government. And eventually he gets under at this time he gets under house arrest, and because these mass killings trigger like upheavals. These people are like eventually they rise up, like think of like Hong Kong today. So they eventually like rise up, think of like and eventually he realizes, oh well, too late, and he goes under house arrest at this time. All right.
So the next leader is Kwame Nkrumah. You might know just a little bit of Ghana if you covered it before you left for break. Ghana is one of the first, if not the first, African nation to gain independence. They gained independence from Britain in 1957. And in 1957, they need a leader because there's no more British rule. And at this point in time, Kwame Nkrumah is actually in prison. But he's in prison and he gets elected as Prime Minister of Ghana, which at this point in time is still known as the Gold Coast. So he's elected as the first president of a nation in prison. Because he's elected, he is released from prison, and he becomes the leader of Ghana for quite a bit of time. During his time as president, he is given the Lenin Peace Prize. And just with that, just the name, having Lenin in the name, we can show that he had some type of connection and he had some type of solidarity with the Soviet Union during this time. During his rule, which was rather long, he was declared president for life. He had a one-party state where he chose his rulers who worked for his government. And he had most of the power, and he was going to be president for the rest of his life because of how the government had changed after independence from Britain. And eventually, the United States became involved in this. They overthrew him in a military coup by the CIA, and he was exiled to Guinea, which is another nation in Africa nearby, and he dies much later at a very old age, not a very old age, but a lot older after his rule in Romania, which, if you know anything about Romania, Romania was a communist nation as well.
So yeah, so I know there's a lot more movements out there, but those were like the key ones that we want to touch on based on like what you based on like trends. You can see there's like there's like anti-imperialist sentiments. We see the rise of dictatorships. We see leaders getting replaced. So now we're gonna move on to, with the help of like either foreign intervention or indirect foreign intervention. So now we're moving on to the effects of the Cold War. So what really were is like political or social or economic causes. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so the Korean War was one of them because it's one of the most famous examples. So you probably heard of Korea or Vietnam. So one of the two or both. So this one was between 1950 to 53. So it's technically like, if you think in perspective, it was not that after like World War II. Actually, so this actually started when like the North Korean, which is supported by China, invaded South Korea, and this just triggered like a split, like a mass conflict in the area. So we see South Korea, and we see the U.S. seeing this. They know that North Korea is allied with China and Russia, and they called to the UN that, hey, they're invading South Korea. That's totally wrong. Let's help them. And then obviously the other reason behind that is to expand, like they try to prevent expanded communism, but this was actually like a good excuse, not excuse, but a good reason for a good justification for the UN to intervene. Because the UN and the US is actually part of like this UN Security Council, like the 5 permanent members of this council with Russia. So China, which they eventually like boycotted. So but usually what happens is that they veto each other. So the UN couldn't really do anything, because you'd be wondering, these wars are happening, these independence movements across Asia and Africa are happening. Why is the UN not doing anything? That's because the US and Russia are like constantly vetoing each other. They're trying to like override each other. So like votes. So nothing really happens eventually. So now they have a good excuse. And at this time, China boycotted and not boycotted, but like they did not like they were not this time like actually voting, like they're vetoing. So the U.S. was able to convince the UN to intervene like with peacekeeping forces. And this is just a long conflict. So you probably watch like documentaries or movies from like a U.S. perspective, like with like General MacArthur. Eventually, though, it ends not definitely. So it's not like peace as we know today. There's still a 38 parallels. So we still see like a Korean armistice agreement. Armistice is not necessarily end of conflict. It's just like more of like an easy truce. And we also see now they're separate nations. Korea was one, like it was united for like centuries and centuries. If you look at history, like there's like the Silla Empire, like they're like one entity. Now they've been separated by this one line and a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, as we still know today, which is interesting because we've been getting press about Kim Jong Un now. So
the Angolan Civil War, this is one of our examples in Africa. Angola is a nation in southern Africa that used to be ruled by the Portuguese. So the Angolan Civil War is from 1975 to 2002. And it's, again, one of those longer ones, more than 25 years long, and it ended in the 21st century. So some of you guys may have actually been alive for part of this war. So the Angolan Civil War was a struggle between two guerrilla movements. In 1975, Angola had just gained independence from Portugal, and the rise of these two sides, one supported by the Soviet Union because they were communist, and one that was anti-communist. So we have the MLPLA, our first one, which is the communists, and then we have UNITA, which are the anti-communists. And at this time, we just have fighting between these two. It is a guerrilla war, again, use of different types of weapons, different types of technological innovations and weapons as well during this war. And at the same time, we have an independence movement happening in a region known as Cabinda. So if you've never heard of it, it makes sense, as Cabinda is not a nation. So it actually, the independence movement was not as successful. But there was an independence movement there at the same time as the Civil War was happening. So it added a lot more struggle, made the country a little more unbalanced during this time as well, to have an independence movement and then a civil war between one group that was supported by the Soviet Union and then the anti-communists. So eventually UNITA, which are the anti-communists, win the war, and their new president is this man named Jonas Savimbi. He's the leader of the UNITA at the end of it, and he is successful and he becomes president. So once the war ends, he had many assassination attempts attempted to him during the time. Someone does shoot him and one of his workers that he's working with. So he dies. So the presidency, this is 2002, reminder, goes to a new president, and his name's Antonio Dembo. But Antonio Dembo was also injured in the assassination as well, and he dies right after. So we've already gone from independence, then the next day, the next president is murdered, and then the person that's supposed to take over him is murdered. So then the presidency goes to a man named Paulo Lukamba, and because of this, there is still instability in Angola as well. It's a poor nation, has just been ravaged by violence and this lack of stability of power. And then I'm going to take the last slide so that we can have Jed do the one after that. So the Sandinista-Contra Conflict in Nicaragua, this is officially 1979 to 1990, but that is only how long the conflict lasted. The Sandinistas and the Contras have only been active from that time, but this really started with the Somoza dynasty in Nicaragua, and they came to power in the 1930s. So I'm just going to do a little bit of historical contextualization, just so we can go and flow from what happened in the 1930s and then go into 1979, 1990s. So if you don't know, Nicaragua, again, was a Spanish colony, gained independence, Latin American wars, which will be tested on the AP exam because that is before the 20th century. So at this point, Nicaragua is an independent nation, not really in the news as much, because nothing's really happening at this point until around the 1930s. So at this point, Nicaragua has this man, and his name is Anastasio Somoza, and he is not leader. He is a highly ranked person in the Nicaraguan government, but he's not exactly leader. So the Antonio Somoza, he becomes leader, and you might wonder how did he become leader? Was there an election? So there wasn't an election, and this was a completely unconstitutional way of becoming leader, and it later leads to, as you see in the second bullet, the Somoza dynasty. So Anastasio Somoza goes to Augusto Sandino, and Augusto Sandino is one of the highest military leaders in Nicaragua at the time, and he murders him. So because he murders him, this country is in a point of political instability, military instability, And because of this, he has the ability to change the constitution, and it starts the beginning of a military dynasty, a political dynasty in Nicaragua. And it's definitely marked by corruption and family dictatorship. He got rid of people that weren't related to him, people that he didn't know personally in political offices, political positions, and he removed them and he replaced them with his own family. And this is a dynasty going on for many, many years, 43 years, and it's going on from 1936 to 1979. And in 1979, the dynasty is overthrown. So again, you're gonna go from political instability, but with a dynasty, and now people, this dynasty's gone, and they don't really know how to deal with it. They haven't had a president, a democratic ruler of some sort since 1936. So this is a completely new feeling. And when drastic changes are made to nations, and we saw that a lot earlier with the other events, like independence, when we were talking about Ghana, when there are rapid changes made to a government, you either have to rapidly transition or something will happen. And in all of these cases that we mentioned today, something has happened and they have led to a proxy war. So Nicaragua has these two sides, opposing sides in this war. We have the Contras, which are supported by the United States, and then we have the Sandinistas, which are communist. And eventually, this is another war that happens in Nicaragua a very long time, as you can see as well. It's longer than our average civil, not exactly civil war, but longer than our average war. Even though all of these wars tend to be on the longer side, all of the Cold War proxy wars, if you've seen, they've all been longer than 15 years so far. So this is a war almost entirely exclusive to rural parts of the country. So you won't see as much fighting in urban areas, places like the capital, like Managua. You won't see as much fighting as you would in northern rural parts of the country. And this leads to a lot of people from Nicaragua leaving. And there is a large amount of Nicaraguans in Miami, for example, parts of Florida. And that's why we have a large Nicaraguan population in the United States. Eventually, this proxy war does end, and the Contras win with the support of the United States, even though the United States never directly fought in this war as well, the definition of a proxy war. And Nicaragua is still unstable as a result of these wars. As you can see, most of these nations are not the most politically stable, just because a lot of these wars were more recent in history. When we look at the Korean War, South Korea used to be one of the poorest nations in the world in the 50s as a result of the Korean War, but there was a major economic boom that you probably did not study because of the situation we're in. But there's a massive economic boom happening in East Asia in the 1980s, and a lot of these places that used to be poorer, places like Japan or Hong Kong or China, are making a lot of technological developments and they become a lot wealthier. So that might be the only exception. Korea has a massive transition. South Korea has a massive transition after this to a strong economy, and South Korea is pretty highly ranked nowadays when it has to do with stuff like GDP, gross domestic product. So that's just a brief review of all of those before we get into something that might take a bit of time. And this is just for you to practice your documents, since this year is a five document DBQ. There's going to be a DBQ after we summarize the end of the Cold War.
So yeah, touching on King Dan's actually question, like Charlie did a good job touching on it actually. So so it did, like as Charlie mentioned, for most cases, it led to more conflict. So we see divisions, we see political divisions from like one nation to like two separate ones. We see a unity, let's say Vietnam, but led to like an authoritarian or like a dictatorship, which is not good at all. So it technically there was still, so common words would hear like not revolution, but like independence movements, civil war, like there's like a dictator, there's like a central figure, there's like political vacuums, once again assassinations, we see people being exiled, we see people being being murdered. We see people like these like in this the interference actually once again. At first, it sounds good, like oh we'll help the U.S. or U.S. and U.S. be like oh we're helping them out. We're just we're making them more united. We're just getting rid of the enemy or the what's making things chaotic over here. But in reality, for the most cases, if you're talking politics, it actually goes the other way around. And economically, though, there are once again some exceptions, like South Korea. Once again, there's like economic boom. So for the most case, it only worsens things because wars are costly, like weapons are costly. So and like the damage to infrastructure is costly. So in the long run, it's really more of a loss than a gain. Socially, there's like some new groups that rise. So like we see more like leaders that like cater to women or like underrepresented groups at this time. So that's probably a gain. But for on the other side, there are also groups that were targeted, like in the mass killings, going back to Sukarno's Indonesia, for example, or like the ethnic cleansings in like or just it's like continuity of like the genocides and like mass atrocities back once again in like since the 1900s, starting with Armenia. Now we see more today, like in the Tutsis and like Rwandan genocide. We see more of that. And while it's not directly connected maybe to the Cold War, but like the local interference in the region, so like by European powers, by U.S., by Russia, gave rise, like through chaos, gave rise to these leaders that condoned that. So it's just important to like make all these connections.
And something that I want to add, I'm sorry if the microphone sounds a little weird. Something that I want to add on to that is that I recently did a stream on this, on mass atrocities of the 1900s, after the 1900s. So stuff like you mentioned, where it is Armenia, Rwanda with the Tutsi and the Hutu. And I also chose 2 events that were caused by the Soviets. So we talked about deportation in the Soviet Union, and we talked about Holodomor, or Ukrainian starvation. So you can definitely check out that stream. It will be archived and it will be on the Fiveable website. And if you just look for me, or if you look for anything that has to do with mass atrocities and anything after 1900, you will most likely find it. And it really relates well, those 2 events specifically, to this.
There you go. Yeah. So if you're really interested, we have a lot of resources for you, especially analyzing the like the implications of the Cold War, or just any other like significant like world war to like local minorities, local groups. So we want to check it out. So moving forward, we're talking about the end of the Cold War now. So once again, it's taking a while, like 40, 50 years, and it's gonna end in 1989 because there's this like so. Obviously, at some point throughout the Cold War, there were like attempts by local like the satellite nations. So when the Soviet Union absorbed the Eastern Bloc and made it part of the USSR, some nations did attempt to revolt against the Soviets, but they were squashed at this time. They were so they may not be mentioned like sporadically throughout the duration of the Cold War, but by this time, there were actually like a set of like revolutions. There were like a couple revolutions. Like this is like the peak, like a peak time. Like Prague Spring. Yes, one of them is the Prague Spring, 1968. So you can tell like 1968, 1970s, 75s, like they come every other year. So, but this was like a peak of like revolutions. 1989, we see them and especially in Eastern Europe. At first, we see like the Velvet Revolution, which was actually a peaceful one, because we see this trend because of like the shift in leadership. So we know that Stalin does not live forever. So we see Brezhnev, we see Khrushchev. So and these leaders actually tried to like usher away from like conventional Stalin like politics. Like they're trying to do like programs like de-Stalinization, where they probably opened a bit of trade, or like a truce, not necessarily a truce, but like some deals with the U.S., which is which are smart moves, because you gotta this has to stop at some point. With and the best way to do it is just talk to your direct opponents. So in the U.S. side, we have Kennedy, we have Kennedy, we have Johnson, we have these presidents that are willing to negotiate. Some deals do make it, some deals don't. So let's, for example, like um, Eisenhower's like Eisenhower tried to make a deal where they tried. He asked the Soviets, tell me about your weapons, tell me about your military, like all about your military. I'll tell you about mine. That failed. But there are also some treaties like SALT, where it's like a military treaty. They were talking about like less like imposing of like these like forced like obedience, and like these Eastern Bloc countries, or like we see some deals that make it, we see some deals that don't, basically. So let's go back to like contextualization. So after World War II, Germany was, so remember, after war there's usually like deals, and like what the winners like take the bounty and all that, like similar to how the Treaty of Versailles worked. So after World War II, Germany was divided to 4 zones, and it was divided between the US, France, and Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And eventually, these 3 zones, 3 of them gets united as one. Go figure why? Because U.S., France, Great Britain are your allies, not only World War II, but just in like ideologically speaking. Because remember, it's capitalism versus communism, capitalist democracies versus communist dictatorships. So eventually, this is where we see the rise of the Berlin Wall. So like between, this is like the symbol of like the Iron Curtain that Churchill mentioned, like the West and East first of all, West and East Germany, but then Western Eastern Europe. And we see once again Germany separated to 2 parts. So communist East Germany, which is that one zone, administrative zone by the Soviet Union, and we have West Germany, which is by the former 3 zones by U.S., France, and Great Britain. And then, give me 1 second to see that. And eventually, it was reunified. So this is where we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. If you look it up, like you look at documentaries about it, it's really interesting. So this was after like, so this was during the time of like the revolutions. There was a time like during that where we see like the favor is getting to like the U.S. side, because we see here that successful revolution. We see more openness in like policies, and we see more openness, basically. So we see more like we can see more that like the public perception of Russia as Soviet Union is like they're the bad guys. So by the time that the Cold War ends, we see the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is like the greatest symbol of the Cold War. So, and Germany's reunified this time. So yeah, there you go. Charlie, can you take the next one? Sorry, I have to go somewhere.
Yeah. So when we talk about dissolution, we're talking about the splitting of something. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as you can see on this map, we have one extremely large country, the Soviet Union, going into 15 smaller yet still substantially large nations. So when we think of the Soviet Union, we automatically think of, I feel like we just think of Russia. In reality, the Soviet Union, there's a lot of other nations involved in that. We have countries like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, just ones I'm coming up with my mind. Those are the European countries only. And then we have countries that are Asian, countries that might speak languages that aren't written with the Cyrillic script, something like Georgian or Armenian or Azeri in Azerbaijan. So the Soviet Union is a place of a lot of ethnic diversity. And that's just something I want to highlight, because when we think of Soviets, we think of Russians. when in reality there's 15 nations with people with different languages and a substantial Muslim population in a lot of these nations as well. So in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. It separates into these 15 countries that now exist today, these 15 separate nations that are all independent and all have their own rulers now. So this is during the presidency of Mikhail Gorbachev, and he tried to enact a lot of new things in this country. It becomes a little less restrictive than it used to be in previous history. We have new political ideologies, things like glasnost and perestroika, which allows for a bit more freedom for the Soviets. So after the Soviet Union separates into its 15 independent republics, they create an organization called the Commonwealth of Independent States. And this Commonwealth, all the different nations that were just from the Soviet Union, they combined, even though they were independent, to work together to improve the life and the status of people that used to live in the Soviet Union. Almost like when we think of the United States with NATO, the North American Trade Organization, I believe, except that's for trade and that lowers tariffs, but this as well is improving the quality of life and making it easier for people who used to be part of the Soviet Union to interact and live healthy lives. So the dissolution of the Soviet Union is what officially ends the Cold War. So the Cold War is this incredibly long war, and it finally ends in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And yeah, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I have no idea why I forgot that. I'm sorry that I said North America. The Warsaw Pact as well, we can mention as well. And then as a result of this, we have the end of communist governments in, I believe, all of these nations as well. They don't all become republics, and they might become different levels of democracy. Countries like Turkmenistan, which is number 13, is not necessarily known for its human rights. Nations like Belarus has had the same president for about 20 years. So it shows that even though they are separate now, they are independent nations as a result of this. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go perfectly. Doesn't mean that everything is going to be a-okay. We saw this in Korea. We saw North Korea and South Korea. They're separated, but they're not exactly on friendship terms as of now. And as a result of that, South Korea, as I mentioned before, was incredibly poor. And it wasn't until the economic boom of the 1980s that Korea really became a power in Asia. So this map shows the previous Eastern Bloc. So this is the Eastern Bloc. When we refer to the Eastern Bloc, we're talking about communist nations, and we're also talking about nations that supported the Soviet Union, although they may not have been geographically located in the Soviet Union, places like Cuba, for example. So just something that's not included on the slides that I think is really interesting. In 1980 and 1984, there were massive people were not attending the Olympics those 2 years. Those were two Olympic years, 1980 and 1984. And one of those major reasons were people were not attending the Olympics. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and that led to a lot of debate around the world, especially about what the Soviet Union had the right to do, what they did not have the right to do. So just something that's interesting if you want to look that up, especially since this year was supposed to be an Olympic year. We don't have the Olympics this year, unfortunately, because of the current situation. But it's always interesting to look about previous Olympics. I actually do really enjoy talking about the Olympics quite a bit. So the Olympics are every 4 years. Summer Olympics are every 4 years, and then the Winter Olympics are every 4 years. So this year would have been in Tokyo, Japan, which is kind of cut in half from that map. But so wasn't there an attempted coup from diehard communists and Boris Yeltsin stopped it? I believe so. There were certain nations that did not participate in those two Olympics, and it was honestly quite a few nations. If you actually look a map look at a map. If I could pull up a map, if we could pull up a map of nations, I do not believe I can pull up a map because the slides belong to Jed, but it's a large chunk of the world. When we're talking about a coup, we're talking about someone seizing the government. So usually coups are a coup d'etat, you might call them instead. That's like the full term of it, a little more Frenchified. When we're talking about a coup, we're talking about taking a government. And during this time, we see a lot of coups around the world. Mainly, we see a lot in South America. We see a coup in 1979 and 1973, I believe, in Uruguay. We see a lot of coups around the world, a lot of political instability. Jed, are you okay? I was going to ask you to go to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Sorry about that. I just had to go somewhere real quick, but thank you for. Yeah. I mean, basically, the next slide is like, do you guys have any questions? Like, do you have any interesting insights? Like King Dan mentioned he mentioned a coup by Boris Yeltsin. So if you guys have any questions or any ideas, if you want like examples to connect to like this year's AP test, or you want to like just general information, you know. I'll give you like a couple minutes for that.
Okay, so just before going in for questions, I was just going to talk a little bit about the 1980 Olympics. So the 1980 Summer Olympics were actually held in Moscow. So there was a major boycott of this, and the Olympics were boycotted by nations like China and Canada. And there was also another Olympic, people were avoiding going to the Olympics. But the United States also boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, as I said, in 1979. So a lot of nations, Argentina, Canada, United States, China, a large portion of Africa, Iran, Turkey, they boycotted the Summer Olympics. And then as a result of that, the Soviet Union and their allies, places like the Soviet Union, Mongolia, Iran again, Cuba, Angola, as we mentioned before, they boycott the 1984 Olympics, which are held in Los Angeles. So as a result of they aren't going to the 1980 Olympics, then they don't go to the Olympics the next year. Okay, I see a question. Jed, you might be able to help me out on this one. So the College Board apparently released a lockdown browser. Do we need to download it in order to take the AP exam?
So I'm looking at I don't remember if it's like publicly announced already, but like I think I'm looking at the link right now. But I know I'm pretty sure like aren't like lockdown browsers supposed to like I think. Yeah, it says here that like so it's telling you. I wish I could share my screen, but I'll just paste it. But I'll just paste it in the chat. But basically, it says that you won't need the lockdown browser your device. So I'm assuming you can just access the website, and they may have their lockdown browser, but you don't need to download it. Let's let me paste it in the chat.
So anyone has any questions about the exam, feel free to ask, because there's so many changes to the exam, and we might be able to help you just because we've been trying to figure out what's going on in this exam too, because we're AP students like you're AP students. So we can kind of give you our insight about what's going on.
And yes, what I put in the chat is taken from the College Board like presentation or / webinar. I'm not sure if this was the one used in the webinar, but
did they release the practice submission? They released a public guide. I know you should have gotten an email last night about like just walking through, but the actual practice submission is not until May 4th, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, May 4th. Like I think yeah. So for now, they did how you mentioned already, like the video, like a simulation, what's gonna happen, but
it's not a practice test. It is just a walkthrough, so you know what it's gonna look like. That should have come to you in email yesterday. Again, if you don't have a College Board account, that might be an issue as to why you didn't get it. I can't think of any other reason why you wouldn't get it. Maybe if you're a freshman, you haven't created your College Board account yet. I would create the College Board account now just because we're 2-3 weeks away from the exam. But there's no practice test. So even when the walkthrough comes on May 4th, it's not an exact practice test. It's just a simulation that's a little more specific, but it's still not AP World walkthrough. It's going to be an AP Humanities, since, you know, the APUSH are doing a DBQ as well. AP Euro are doing a DBQ as well. So it's going to be made for all of those courses that are doing a DBQ, not just AP World.
Although you want like practice, maybe like part of the practice is in AP classroom, but focus on, if you know, you can ask your teacher. But this is what I did for my teacher. Like, reach out. Like, there is some like good prompts to practice on, or some documents to practice on. So, you know, you can collaborate with your teacher. You know, yeah. So moving forward, so we have look at time. We're gonna do like just one. This time we're gonna do one HIPP analysis. So if you remember from previous streams, once again, or HIPP, it's a skill we use to analyze documents, and I'm pretty sure y'all here, you're on the right pace. You're familiar with it, but just while we're doing this, you can read right now, but like just for recap for those who wants a refresher, historical context, what's going on, audience, or cap. Oh yeah, I haven't heard of cap before, but I'll see context. But I intended the audience, who is the piece meant to, what the piece is POV, whose opinion, perspective is it representing, purpose, why is this written, outside evidence, that's more of like an option. Not, you can only do it twice to get the maximum number of points, but like what's not mentioned in documents. And I know a lot of people like miss the point. We're talking about events that were not even referenced in the what do you call it, in the document, whether it be on the caption or in the document itself. So make sure, because otherwise, if you're talking about that event that they mentioned, it's just context. But if you want outside evidence, think outside that bubble.
Yeah, and you can always use outside evidence. That's just like, outside evidence is a decent amount of points. So I'd always use outside evidence. Me personally, I learned happy, which is essentially the same exact thing. You're looking for the same exact things. One of the things I always like to do when I do a document analysis, and I don't know if you mentioned it, is to try and find a bias if possible. That's usually how I like to get in my document analysis, because usually in the headings, I can easily find something that would make the person biased. And in this one, I can kind of see already something that could make it a little biased. So you don't have to do all of these letters on an AP exam. Don't be stressed that you have to find every single one. You want to get as many as you can, but like, don't freak out about it. And remember, this year, even all the other years, there's still a complexity point, which is something that you always want to think about, making your writing strong, a strong level, because AP World is a college level course. So just something to keep in mind, especially since the DBQs are out of 10 this year, and one of your points is the complexity point. That's something that I would practice.
Also, shout out to everyone who so if you go to the community.fiveable.me, we have like practice prompts. So I uploaded the ones for the previous Q&A session. So if you reply to that, thank you. Shout out to you. I did ask there once again. Charlie mentioned don't do all HIPP, but I'm hoping that if you did that practice, I'm hoping that by now, like there should be like at least like your top 1 or 2 favorite like HIP or happy components that you want, you prefer, or you find it easy, or you find it hard or difficult. So yeah, that's the hope of that activity. We're gonna do more of that as we get closer. So going back to the document, if you're not done reading, once again, I'll give you some more time on that. But I know some people are giving answers, so we'll wait for another minute. But yeah, adding on to the bias part. Like for me, I usually look at. I'm not sure if it's more about bias. I mean, probably is. I would call it bias, but I look more at tone words, like charged words. Like, like when you're accusing someone, you use like really like extreme words. Like, I mean, already I can name a couple in there, but like I'll wait for y'all. So, let's see. Whoops. And yeah, King Dan did mention Yalta Conference. So yes, that's the one between Churchill, Stalin, and oh my God, I forgot it. Who's the third guy? I forgot. I should know this. But the big three, basically the big three of the World War II. Before even the Cold War. But you can talk about alliances for that. Yeah. Let's see. Now I'll go over answers. We can go over answers. So Nessa said, historical context: Soviet Union created popular governments in Eastern European countries, and Churchill called Iron Curtain. Good connection to the speech, and especially when you added like some actual quotes from the speech by Churchill, which is really like explicitly referenced like briefly in the what do you call this, in the document. And you did say, that counts more as, it counts as context. So you can get you get the point. Let's see, Tanya. Point of view is the USSR. Yes. Purpose is to put down Britain and NATO after Iron Curtain speech. Yes. It's basically like what we call today is rhetoric. You know, we see Churchill throwing shade at so USSR, and now they're just clapping back. And outside evidence, anything for Iron Curtain speech. Yeah, but you can. I was going to say something along those lines. So just by saying Iron Curtain speech itself won't count because it was already mentioned. But I wouldn't stick to like you can say that, and you can talk about more about like if you know more about that topic. I would add more in that, like more speeches against communism. So you can probably talk about more of some other countries' like speech if you know of any. But maybe that will count, but don't explicitly say Iron Curtain speech. Let's see. Okay, yeah. Purpose: decrease Western European influence. Yes. So you can see here that he's obviously villainizing Mr. Churchill. He's saying he's pretending to be their friend, second paragraph. And you can tell, like, you can see part of his ideology at the end. Common people too. I can't see that. Give me a sec. Common people too have their opinions and their own politics. So he's saying that the U.S. is, or just the West in general is kind of taking that privilege away in their perspective. And you can see the first paragraph. He's justifying the reason why communism is working, especially like you can tell, like even like in like once again the proxy wars or the conflicts. You see like the rise of dictatorships, the rise of like new powers, or like there's a civil war, there's power vacuums, and and for the most part, like those at the top are like communists, and they're citing that like success of like dictatorships, like for like 5s and 10s of years they're citing as being successful. That going against capitalism is working because, especially like remember World War I, Great Depression area. This is where people are like, dang, businesses aren't just it. Like businesses won't feed us every day, and then we see more of this distrust moving forward from World War II, and then afterwards, and then in the Cold War. So he was supporting communism because remember, speaker, look at the captions. Some of you don't get thrown off just because you see Mr. Churchill doesn't mean that's Churchill's speech. So if you don't don't skim through like even the minute, not minute details, but like the caption, it's at least the caption or the background information. No, you're not gonna fail, Tanya. Let's see. Going back to the second paragraph, we're talking about POV. Last sentence, or if I'm reading that right, it is the millions of what do you call this? It is the millions of these common people who voted Mr. Churchill, giving their votes to the Labour Party. they're calling them they're called out of England. So out of England, so they're calling like they're supporting those who like didn't vote for them, like who are going against them locally. Like, let's see, Mr. Zucker said resources skin paragraphs. Oh yeah, Mr. Zucker is also like an awesome like teacher streamer we have here. So you definitely use that strategy. I mean that's one of the good one of the like I wish I knew that when I took the test. But yeah, usually first and last sentence because think of it think like a writer, you know, you want to hook the audience and you either write the hook either in the beginning or the end. That's why if like imagine just think of like you're in like a middle of like a revolution and there's this leader like giving a speech, he's hyping everyone up. Like usually you see even in movies like the last sentence just like makes them like shout and scream and like in pride, you know. If you like imagine all those like revolutionary films. So yeah. You're getting it. So, I think did someone touch on audience? Let me look. Someone did touch on context, POV, purpose. Oh yeah, someone did. Yeah, USSR. Yeah, nice. And yeah, you can do outside evidence for Yalta conference. Yeah, so you guys are nailing it. So, last call for questions. And before we go,
Yeah, the last person is FDR.
FDR. Wait, was it FDR? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I didn't.
You didn't die yet.
I did say like you, Stalin.
Yeah, Stalin, Churchill, FDR.
Sure. Oh, yeah, FDR. Oh my gosh. Yeah, because I was like, who am I forgetting? So thank you, Nisa. Both extra credit for that. Oh yeah, quick plug too, Fireball Olympics. So if you don't have a team, you know, usually go to our we have a Discord or we have like a you know just hop in our Fireball posts. But AP Olympics is coming. Earn points. There's actual prizes. Laptop. There's like a laptop. There's like food deliveries to your school, not school, but like home or team. Like actual money. Oh, go for that laptop. Yeah, I think top 3 teams. There's like top certain number of people, individual scores, I think. And I think there's also for schools, but there's like different competitions. But check it out. But yeah, any last things to say or anything to add on? All right, thank you guys for hanging around with us. You know, it may not be like some of you are wondering like Cold War. It's not in the AP test. Why am I supposed to learn this? It's really important, especially moving forward. If you're even if you're doing Euro or U.S. history, it's gonna matter a lot next year. So, and it's just a really interesting to see how things unfold from across the world. It's like one of the most like global events that shaped world history. So. How did you get the delivery recorded? Good question. We'll see. We'll see. So Amanda, Amanda and the Fiveable team will be posting a blog at the end of this week, I think, on what's gonna happen, that specifics. So yeah, thank you guys. I'll give it to Charlie.
So I guess that's the end of the stream because it doesn't seem like anyone else is gonna have questions. It was really great here to kind of just summarize this really quick, and I hope that all of you guys do well in the AP exam. And anything you want to say?
I'm good, yeah. So see you around, I guess.
Bye.
Bye.